Chapter 5. Matt felt that as the leader of the club, he had to be the bravest, but the more he heard about this lake business, the less brave he became. It took all his courage to begin to walk down the path toward the lake. Come on, guys, we're almost there, he said. Tony took his place in the scout's position, and the group reluctantly followed. Levart Lake. That's a strange name for a lake. Do you think it was named after someone named Levart? He wondered aloud, trailing after Matt and Katie. Tony turned around to answer. Grandpa was just beginning to tell me what he had figured out about that name. He said it was a clue to the mystery, and he felt sure he was on to something. But then my mother came back into the room. She was in the kitchen talking to the dietitian about Grandpa's meals. He got this thing about eating yellow. He wouldn't eat anything yellow. Anyway, as soon as my mom came back, he stopped talking and winked at me. He's funny that way. He likes to keep secrets. Did you ever think that he might be a little batty? Hooter called from the back of the line, for they were not all walking single file. You know how some old people get, he continued. They spend so much time just sitting around that they stop eating stuff that's yellow and start making up stories. Tony's face flushed red as he turned around to face Hooter. Maybe your grandfather's batty and makes up stories, but mine isn't, he said emphatically. Whose grandfather are you calling Batty? Hooter came up to the front of the line and towered over Tony. Look, you two, Matt interrupted. No one is calling anyone's grandfather Batty. We're all in this club together, and we can't be fighting with each other. We have to depend on one another like the rebels did. We're comrades, remember? So cut it out and shake, he ordered. Hooter reluctantly put out his hand, and he and Tony shook, trying not to look at each other in the process. Ugh! Q suddenly let out a scream. I knew it! I knew I was going to walk into a web, he moaned as he tried to get a sticky spider web off of his face. Katie was able to help him get untangled with her sword. She even offered to wash his glasses with her squirt gun. Meanwhile, Tony had regained some of his bravery and was scouting ahead. We're almost to the lake, he called back to them. It's just down this bank. Once we're off the path and out of the woods, we'll be able to see better. The moon is almost full. Yeah, what phase would you say the moon is in tonight? Matt asked, looking up. Suddenly they all stopped and were looking up at the bright orb that hung above the trees. 3/4, Q said with authority. He had read all the astronomy books in the school library. Definitely a 3/4 moon. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Matt asked uneasily. That's just what I was thinking. In fact, I was already thinking it 5 minutes ago, Q said, adjusting his glasses on his nose. Aw, come on, you guys, Hooter said. You don't believe that old story about the moon and some boat, do you? And I'm not saying that your grandfather's Betty or anything, Tony. Maybe he just had a great imagination. My marshmallows, Katie murmured. I dropped my marshmallows. But Matt and the rest of the club were so busy discussing the legend again that no one paid any attention to Katie. In fact, it was almost another 10 minutes before anyone noticed she was missing. When he finally realized that Katie was no longer beside him, Matt began calling her name and shining his flashlight into the shadows. I should never have let her go of her I should have never let go of her hand, he sighed. Katie, can you hear me, Katie? It's all my fault. Q shook his head as he pointed his flashlight up and down the path. She put down the bag of marshmallows to help me when I got caught in the spider web. No, Manasys, it's my fault. I'm the president of the club, and I should never have let her come. If anything happens to her, But he never finished his sentence, for there was suddenly a loud splash, followed by the sound of rippling water. Matt immediately turned toward the direction of the splash, and everyone followed him down the path, running as fast as they could. Once out of the woods, they found themselves standing in a small incline just above the shore. The lake stretched out before them, lit in the eerie white glow of the moonlight, and floating on the silvery ripples of its surface was a boat, an empty old rowboat. Matt and the rest of the boys stood transfixed, watching as the breeze picked up and gently sent the lonely craft on its course to shore. Oh no, Matt gasped, his eyes following the boat to the lake's edge, for there on the pebbled beach stood a little figure with red curls blowing back on her head as the early autumn breeze swept across the water. She stood perfectly still as if waiting for the boat, and then it finally reached her. She smiled, a very strange smile. Katie, no, Matt cried out, but it was no use. His little sister was climbing into the boat. Her legs were so short that she was having a hard time hoisting herself over the side. Katie, stop! Get away from it! Matt yelled frantically, but still Katie paid no attention. When he first laid eyes on the empty boat floating in the moonlight, Matt was filled with a sense of wonder mixed with fear. The very emptiness of the boat seemed to be beckoning to him to come and fill it. None of the boys could speak at first. They were overcome with a strange longing to board the lonely craft. Standing on the incline, still at a distance from the boat, Matt also felt the terror rising within him. There was something very wrong with this vessel, something dangerous and powerful. A strange force seemed to be present. Matt knew deep down that they should run from this thing, run as far away as they could. But the sight of his sister caught in this mysterious force sent him running straight for it instead. Hooter, Tony, and Q had the same mixed feelings. But when Matt took off to rescue Katie, they didn't hesitate to join him. They were all yelling at Katie to get away from the boat when they suddenly came in within a few feet of it. Matt was just ahead of them, and so he was the first to come under the boat's spell. It was the same desire to board the boat that he'd felt when he first saw it, only now the desire had become overwhelming. All of his fear and mistrust were suddenly gone. The tautness left his face. The lines on his forehead disappeared as Matt began to smile. He reached out for Katie and lifted her into the boat. Then he climbed in himself. Hugh and Tony did the same thing. Did the same. Hooter gave the boat a shove and jumped in after them, smiling as if in a trance. Matt reached for an oar. Q reached for the other one, and they began rowing toward the center of the lake, the smiles never leaving their faces. When a large cloud drifted across the moon, the old rowboat and its smiling crew were suddenly engulfed in a thick, velvety darkness. An iridescent mist began to slowly swirl around them as they sat motionless. Q and Matt were on one seat and Tony and Hooter on the other, with Katie kneeling on the floor between them. A low whistling sound seemed to circle them as the boat began to tremble and the mist wrapped around them like a cocoon. When the three-quarter moon finally returned from behind a cloud, the lake stretched out smooth as glass beneath it. The old rowboat and her adventurous crew were gone, vanished. It was as if the lake had swallowed them up. The only evidence that remained of the mysterious craft and her spellbound sailors were the silvery ripples that fanned out from the lake's center. As the wind picked up, it blew across the sparkling surface, smoothing out the uneven choppiness of the departure. All that remained was a gentlest hint of a wave.